Today we're going to talk about key one, which is to find your advantage. Now this is very important because what your advantage is going to set the standard for everything you do in your marketing communications. Now this can be likened to writing an essay or writing a paper. You're going to have a thesis. And when you write a thesis, you have a thesis sentence, and everything in your paper is going to be based on that particular thesis. Well, this is the same thing in marketing with your competitive advantage. Everything that you're doing is going to be based on your competitive advantage. So this is very important. Now we have a little tool that we use to help us find our competitive advantage. It's called a SWOT analysis. Now most of the time when I bring up SWOT analysis, people think I'm talking about the exterminator killing some bugs or something, but that's not the case. It's spelled a little bit differently. SWOT analysis is spelled S-W-O-T rather than S-W-A-T. But I still like the fly swatter because if you do the SWOT analysis right, you can swat your competition. Now, part of this process of a SWOT analysis is to take each letters that are part of the SWOT, S standing for strengths, W standing for weaknesses, O standing for opportunities, and T standing for threats. So go ahead and get out a piece of paper. Now on your piece of paper, I want you to number from 1 to 10, and these are going to be your strengths. So I want you to think about your company, organization, or the particular product that you're trying to market, and I want you to think of 10 strengths and write them down on your paper. I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that. Okay, now I told you to write down 10. Hopefully you thought of at least 5 before we move on. Does everybody have 5? Okay. Now the next is W, which stands for weaknesses. Now we're talking about weaknesses. We're looking at internal things in your organization or about your product that are a negative. So this might be something like you have a really high cost of production for your product, or perhaps you don't have enough trained employees. Those are examples of weaknesses. So again, 1 through 10. Try to think of 10, get at least 5 weaknesses for your product or your organization. We're going to skip the O and opportunities for a moment. We're going to come back to that. And we're going to jump down to T, which stands for threats. Now when we're talking about threats, we're talking about external negatives and threats to the organization. So these would be environmental factors, perhaps things like high gas prices. Let's say you're manufacturing SUVs which use a lot of gas. Now when gas prices go up, a threat to your product is the high gas prices. That's definitely going to have an effect on your product. So again, 1 through 10, try to think of 10 external things that are threats to your organization. I'll give you a couple minutes to work on that. All right, great job everybody, great job. Now we're going to go back to the O's. You've just written out perhaps 20 things that are weaknesses and threats, and that could be a little depressing. So now we're going to go back with the O's and opportunities, and I want you to go back to your list, and everywhere there is a strength, I want you to write an opportunity, a way you can capitalize on that strength and use it in the marketplace. Then do the same thing for your weaknesses and your threats. Now this might be a little bit tougher, but let's say the idea of we have employees that are not trained. Now, you can turn that into an opportunity because you can actually start from scratch. You've got employees that don't have to unlearn things. You can use that as an advantage, that you actually have the opportunity to train them the right way. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to go through and write opportunities for your strengths, your weaknesses, and your threats. Great, now we've completed our SWOT analysis. You've done your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats. Now comes a very important step. We're going to go back to your list of strengths, and I want you to put a star next to those strengths that are unique, competitive advantages, things that you can do in the marketplace that your competition cannot. Now this is important. These are the kind of things that cannot be quickly or easily copied by your competition. Now, I will warn you that it's very difficult to have a competitive advantage based solely on product in today's marketplace. Now, in the past, someone could come up with a new invention, and it might be years before somebody could figure out what they were doing and how to copy it or produce it themselves. Today, with the technology we have, it's not as difficult, and typically, it's not a long period of time before something hits the market and you have a version in the dollar store. So it's very difficult to have a sustained competitive advantage based on product alone. Again, with technology, or if you're doing something on the internet or with software, it's very easy to copy those things, legally or illegally. So it's difficult to have a sustained competitive advantage based on that alone. So I would warn you that that's a difficult thing to pick as your competitive advantage. Another thing I would stay away from is price. A lot of people say low price is how we are better than our competition. But if you think of the definition of competitive advantage, it's something that cannot be quickly or easily copied by your competition. And if you think about price, that is something that can be very easily and quickly copied by your competition. Let's say your competition is charging $100 for the same product and you're charging $95. Overnight, all they have to do is knock $5 off their price, and they're able to copy your supposed advantage that you have in the marketplace. Therefore, I would caution you not to try to use price to differentiate yourself in the marketplace. Now, I know you're saying a lot of people say I'm the low price leader, or they try to use price to differentiate themselves. But I would submit to you that it's not a wise strategy, and particularly for you, I'd warn against doing something like that. So I'm going to give you a few moments to go through and look at your strengths and pick which one is your unique competitive advantage. Great. So you've found at least one competitive advantage. Perhaps you found more than one. Now, if you found 2 or 3, I would like you to look at those and pick which one you find is the strongest one for your particular market. It's very difficult to promote one competitive advantage effectively, but when you're trying to promote 2 or 3, it gets confusing. It gets confusing to your customers. It gets very expensive. So if possible, I would say try to focus on one. Or perhaps there's a way that you can combine your 2 competitive advantages into one coherent idea that you can easily communicate. There might be the case too where some of you have found that you don't have a competitive advantage. You've really looked at it and you said, you know, there's nothing about me that's unique or different than my competition, so what am I going to do now? Well, there's a couple of options. One is to just go home and say, this was not a good idea. And in the long run, that might not be bad. You've saved yourself some money. You've laid out on paper. You've seen strategically that there's not really any real reason for people to buy your product over your competition. And you might be saving yourself a lot of money. Or you can really look at what you've listed as strengths, any competitive advantages, and maybe you can rework a little bit and be a little bit more realistic about what you have to offer and maybe put a little bit different perspective on it. One way to do this is to be first to market. Now, there might be competitors of your product And we talked about people copying your product. But if this is the case, you were the first one to create it, there is a way you can promote yourself as the first to market and the originator of a product. That way, anybody else that comes into the market and is offering what you're offering is considered a copycat. You're the original, you're the first, and if you can promote that message in people's minds, that in itself can be a great competitive advantage. Another problem that I see people doing is that they tend to say and focus, we have quality, or we are offering quality, we're the quality leader, things like this. Now, quality itself is arbitrary, and it's something that it's really about the perception of your consumer. And it really doesn't have a whole lot of meaning, or it means something different to different people. It's going to mean something different to me than it does to Jim, than it does to George, than it does to Marketing Genius over here. We all have a different perception of what quality is. Quality is in the mind of the consumer. So if you're going to use terms like quality, another suggestion is to define what you mean by quality. Now, I worked with a restaurant that's one of the things we want to promote, is that they were a quality restaurant. So I pushed them a little bit further and said, what exactly do you mean by quality? What does that mean to you? And they said, well, we have very friendly service and we have a family atmosphere here. So I said, well, why don't you say we have a family atmosphere and we have really good service? I said, oh yeah, that makes more sense. So if you want to use those kind of elements, or you're thinking of quality, really define what you mean by quality so it's being communicated to your consumer. And remember that they don't know what you mean by these things. And most of the time they don't really care. So it's your job as a marketer to really make it simple, make it something that's easy to grasp and to remember. Another example of the quality myth, as I call it, was New Coke. Now, a few years ago, the CEO of Coke was very happy in some ways because Coke was doing very well in the cola wars. Coke and Pepsi had been going head to head for years, and for the first time Coke really was starting to take the lead and really had a great market share over Pepsi. The only problem for the CEO of Coke was that when they did taste tests between Coke and Pepsi, people tended to pick Pepsi. So in a blind taste test, when they tasted Coke and Pepsi, people preferred the taste of Pepsi better. Well, this really drove this guy crazy, and he said, hey, you know, there's something wrong here. Our product is not as high quality as Pepsi, or people would be picking it. So they decided to change the formula of Coke and make it a little bit more like Pepsi. And he figured, hey, if we do this, we've already got a market lead, and then we improve the quality of the taste of our cola, we're really going to take over. The problem is when they introduced New Coke into the marketplace, people were very upset. They had grown to embrace the Coca-Cola name. They loved it. They did not want any changes. People were very upset. And they considered New Coke inferior to the old Coke in quality just because it was something different. In fact, people were going crazy. People were starting to hoard the old Coke. People were auctioning off for $100 a case, things like this, because they wanted to make sure they still had a supply of their favorite old Coke, which they considered of higher quality than the new Coke. Well, Coke was smart enough to learn from their mistake, and a few months later, they released Classic Coke with the old formula and sold it alongside New Coke. But if you look today, you won't see New Coke or Classic Coke anymore. You just see plain Coke, which is actually the original formula. So the lesson to learn from that is that quality is not necessarily the product, it's what the perception is in the mind of your consumer. So I'm not saying that you can put an inferior product on the market. Your product needs to do what you're saying that it will do. But people do expect that in general. Your product's going to perform and do what you say it's going to do. By saying it's quality, you're really just saying it's going to perform up to the standards that you've already set. And I think people expect that anyway. So you can't put something inferior on the market and expect people to buy it or to think it's a quality product. But just remember, quality really is in the mind of the consumer. Another thing to keep in mind is that most people, when they talk to them or there's been surveys done, they tend to think of whatever the leader in the category is as being of quality. So whatever sells the most tends to be thought of as being the quality product in that particular market. Whether or not the person buys that product is a different story, but they still perceive the number one seller as being the quality product in the market. So if you go into a store in general, people, even if they're buying a generic cola, they're going to consider Coke to be the quality product simply because they know more Coke is sold than any other cola product. Okay, so let's bring this back to the competitive advantage. Now your tagline is the part of your marketing communications that really communicates your competitive advantage to your audience. So as much as possible, you want to take your competitive advantage and distill it down into something that's easy to understand and communicate to people. And also, if you can use rhyming tools or alliteration, that's also going to be very helpful in getting the message across as much as possible, the reason why people should buy your product over the competition. Now, I like to look at a couple examples of taglines that don't do this, so we can kind of learn from their mistakes. One is Nike. Just do it. Well, just do what? It's not really clear how this promotes the advantage of Nike over their competition. And I know you're probably saying that's a very successful campaign and Nike's a very big company, but they've also spent billions, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars promoting their product. And I would say that their success has more to do with all that money spent than it does with a good tagline. I would also say if they used a better tagline, they probably would have a stronger market share. So if you've got a few $100 million or $1 billion to spend on your marketing, I would say go ahead and don't worry about your tagline. But if you're like most of us, you can use your mind, you can use your brain, you can improve your marketing IQ, you can be a little bit smarter with how you market. Use a tagline that's really going to communicate clearly what your advantage is in your marketplace and be much more expensive and have a much better return on the investment of your promotions. Another example I like to use is a fairly new tagline for Budweiser. The new tagline for Budweiser is, "This is beer." Again, not really very descriptive. I guess it says what it is, it's beer. But as far as all that work we did with our SWOT analysis and looking at competitive advantages, how does that tagline really communicate to you why this is a better product than the competition? It doesn't. So we've looked at these things. We've gone through, really a difficult process of doing a SWOT analysis. That's really the what of your organization. That's the what that you're going to be communicating to people in your marketing promotion. Now the next key 2, is your why, and that is to define your purpose. See you tomorrow.